So we have collected some ideas that people had about what to talk about. It's still 2. Oh, okay, right. And we've just randomly estimated 15 minutes per topic, and as you can see, that means we've actually got enough to talk about so far to take us through to the coffee break. I have a feeling that some of these will go longer than 15 minutes, and that's fine, unless we've got more proposals that people would like to add that would actually fill out the second half of this morning's presentations, because our plan is to work through till 12:30. There's lunch in the room next door. Of course, there's the usual 10:30 break. You know, we're short on topics for day 2. That was deliberate. When Warren and I were plotting the agenda, we only made enough plans to carry us through the first day because we knew that there'd be a lot of discussions that would hold over or would be generated during the social last night. So if you have other topics, just volunteer to lead a discussion, and we will put it on the schedule. Okay. Pindar is in the blockchain digital currency realm right now and is willing to tell us why. So we'll put that at the very end. I have no idea. All right. So of the topics that we see on this agenda, only the first one has got slides associated with it. And so we're going to move directly to that one. So.
Did I get the clicker too?
He wants to know if he can have the clicker.
I can give you the clicker in a second. So, morning. I guess while we get the clicker, the idea is really just based on the discussion yesterday, and I wanted to take explore the idea a little bit further about the 2 drafts that were presented, and I'll start by saying that this is really based mostly on what I heard yesterday, and kind of as I was listening, running through the draft. So if I missed something, you know, this is a very preliminary idea. So it seemed from the discussion yesterday, this seems to be that the problem statement is that we need a somewhat standard mechanism for many more instances of the root zone to be distributed and used, and that's a very important part, and used for resolution at different localities or more remote localities, as I put it in quote. And there are 2 whys, it seems that from what I heard, but again, correct me. One is expedience, the faster speed, less hops, and the other one is control of the traffic, whether it's mitigation against surveillance or actually doing surveillance or any kind of control, of the resolution path. So, and maybe some others. That's kind of what I got. So that's the premise of what I'm moving forward on. So again, I'll skip this part and saying whether this is actually a problem, but assuming those are concerns and assuming they're valid, we were presented with 2 drafts, the Hoffman-Kumari and the Vixie draft. And to me, after listening to it and reading through it, it seems to me that there are actually more commonalities. When I first read it, before yesterday, it seemed to be completely different ideas. But when I read more into it, it really seems to be much more. There are much more commonalities. The Hoffman-Kumari side, suggests a loopback using the loopback. Sorry, it shouldn't be locals, but anyway. So a loopback idea, using the loopback address. The Vixie draft actually suggests IN assigned. I'm calling surrogate to avoid the alternate word surrogate set of NS as a hint file. That's really what it is. And using VXC's model of the localhost LAN campus, really it could be deployed anywhere. Both ideas could be inserted at any point. Of course, the IANA assigned one requires IANA to do some work before it can be done. And in terms of the this is how I kind of visualize it. I guess, again, poke holes in whatever. That's very preliminary. Right now, this is the thing that we're trying to address, and it's the priming exchange. And really, both drafts touches on a possibility of creating some kind of alternate path. So instead of that, and within some network locality, both drafts actually, addresses that. And instead of a priming process, there would be a kind of zone transfer into the alternate path served by the alternate path root servers and affecting dependent users under the particular recursive resolver. That's, in a way, that's how I interpreted it. And the Hoffman-Kumari idea has the stub hint in the loopback, and of course VXC uses an Anycast IP. Basically points the surrogate hint drive to some known and managed Anycast IP. So in a way, I know it's a very bad way to describe this, but for this particular purpose, you could really think of the 127 as almost like a known Anycasted IP. So to me, it makes not a huge difference for this particular purpose. So, and many of the issues are very similar. So if you look at it this way, then all the types of attacks can be pointed at either type of implementation, and both of which can already be done today. Of course, the Hoffman-Kumari scenario, it can be done as is. You can deploy it today. With the VXC draft, you can also do it today, except you would have to replicate all the root NSIPs, right? I mean, you should. And when Jeff mentioned about Google yesterday, I was thinking maybe that's what they're doing. I mean, maybe they're running mirrors of. I'm just saying maybe they're running mirrors of all the root servers within their network. I mean, that would exactly do the same the job, in essence. So in light of that and some of those criticism, I was thinking through this idea, and I kind of brought it up, and in fact it was sparked by Paul Makabitra's and VXC's conversation, is using the Huffman framework and putting it in as a local copy. Why don't isn't it possible that we could use the IANA signed surrogate root NS in that form? So we would assign a set of Anycast IPs, and any network can choose to use that, and that's a kind of a unmanaged Anycast IP. So basically bring together the two ideas. And so, of course, the question is this going to be the best of both worlds or the worst of both worlds? I mean, you're putting on the problems. And of course, I think it's the best of both worlds, and here's why. And so between the two, this is how I see it. This is really the biggest difference between the two proposals. One of the criticism is the diddle stuff can't work. Stuff that people is looking at the network can't figure out things. On the VXC proposal, the biggest problem is alternate route or opening up that issue, and it boils down to distrust. On the Hoffman side, it's a distrust of resolver operators or ISPs, very dodgy. We talked about that issue. And on the VXC side, it's a distrust on layer 8 or 9 or whatever higher powers there may be in toying or playing with the alternate route idea. So in terms of the combined concept, I guess, why use non-127? I guess probably the benefit is that with 127, everything is still very obscure. But if you use any casted IP that's assigned, you have a slightly better chance of getting some more transparency. So if you're a dependent host, you might be able to figure out what your upstream is trying to do by doing certain things, right? By basically checking out those IPs and where they hop to. And it kind of eliminates part of the alternate route concern, and so that the signed kind of what I call surrogates are used only locally. It could be pretty much deployed the same way that the Hoffman concept has it, and so that's it. And just a couple more comments on it. There were some assumptions that were put out by both drafts that I find kind of problematic. On the Hoffman side, Paul seems to feel that there will be very few of these installations, like, not a lot of people who use it and very small number of users use it. That's probably not so true. I think the discussion pointed to some bigger providers do that today already, and that's I guess if we do something, we write up something, maybe it's not that assumption might not be correct. Although the need for that may be correct, but the assumption that only small number of remote resolvers would use this is probably not correct. The assumption that the VXC side, main assumption is that the desire for autonomy for particular hosts. That again, I think, is somewhat problematic because I think part of the use of this is for some dependent hosts to actually use it. So under a particular ISP or under a particular nation or under particular parts of the network. So not so sure that the particular assumption is correct either. But it boils back down to, so we can do this anyway today. Are there real concerns? Do we really need a new standard or best practice? That I think probably we need to rethink it. And if it is the case, then of course I think the combined solution gives us a little bit better from the two of them separately, and then there are following discussions that were talked about yesterday afternoon. Because when we had the discussion yesterday afternoon, a lot of the questions was, why are we doing this? Why do we need a very reliable and scalable zone distribution? Well, it is because we had an assumption that this whole thing is needed. So if we do need it, then we need a reliable and scalable zone distribution. That's kind of my thoughts. Thank you.
So actually, Paul Hoffman and I had some discussions on why doing it on local net or local host instead of a sort of public IP address. And our sort of technical reason for that is we really like having the fact that it's one machine or one device. The advantage to that is if something goes wrong, like the machine becomes disconnected from the internet or it goes boom or whatever, the only thing that gets affected is yourself. If you have it on a sort of public address and other people are slaving from you or querying you or something, and that machine becomes unavailable, and we're assuming because lots of people are going to do this, they're not always going to be run very well, you have a whole population of people who get affected. Keeping the failure local to yourself. I mean, most failures are machine locks up, becomes disconnected from the internet, the name answering process dies. Having them all be having sort of fate sharing means that there are not other people affected.
So in response to that, I guess, yes, probably better containment. That's why I didn't mention that. I forgot to mention that. But there's still, I guess, the main benefit of using 127 is better containment. However, if we think about it, if we have a well-known set of anycast IPs unmanaged, well-known unmanaged anycast IP, conceptually should be the same. I mean, nobody would, if you care about being dependent, Nobody would. Yeah. Of course, that's true. Theoretically, okay. I will add theoretically, but probably not practically. So anyway,
I'll object to even theoretical. So from a security perspective, what you don't want, if there's going to be an attack, which we assume that there can be because we're talking about root zone information, there's lots of different parties that would want to pollute that for lots of different reasons. You want, if you're going to add a new feature to a system, which is what we're proposing, you want to add as few entry points for an attacker as possible. With localhost, you're adding one place, and you're adding a place that you can in fact check all the time. You can keep looking at it. When you're doing unmanaged anycast, you are adding, Paul had hoped millions of places that, for an attacker to attack. Now, that attacker will only get 1/1,000,000th of, the total availability, but you're now making it much, much less manageable on a pure security side. So containment is good. Warren brought up containment for error, and that's fine. I worry much more about containment for attack. And so I don't think that they are, so many of your arguments earlier, you're correct that the kinds of insecurity we're adding are similar, but I think the attack surface is quite different.
so yeah, in response to that, yes, I can probably agree to that. But therein lies two things. One thing first is that 127, it could be a separate box too. I mean, no?
Absolutely not.
Oh.
Absolutely not. No operating system will take a packet that is destined for 127/8 anything. They will not even put it on the inside address of a NIC.
Okay.
That stays inside. If we wanted
So it would
what
be
you
a
just
different-
proposed, we would have said 10-53-53-53.
Okay.
So that really, and part of that is also to go back, one of the things that Paul had said yesterday on not exposing requests and such. In ours, the request doesn't even hit a NIC. Well, I mean, it might in a very badly configured operating system. But our requests don't even hit a NIC that somebody could be promiscuous on.
So my second half of the argument is that you're looking at it as an operator of the DNS, in a way. I think the VXI point of view is the reliability of a more of a user point of view, right? So what's less likely to, what more controlled can I get? If my upstream uses your method, then I have less ways of figuring it out or mitigating against it, than the VXI model. So the real balance we probably need to think about is between those two. So that's.
So this is Vixie. I don't currently see a reason to try to combine these drafts because they have different problem statements. They could proceed independently.
And our names are so different, so.
Yes. So they could proceed independently, both potentially reach IETF consensus and become standards and not interfere with each other at all. I appreciate that they look similar, and we have a tendency as technologists to say that, what's the grand unifying principle? Is there some compromise that could be made that would cut down on the number of different logic descriptions and different things that had to be audited and so forth? But at the moment, I'm seeing that there is a pretty obvious benefit to each of them. There may also be an obvious benefit to what Maka Petras proposed yesterday during my presentation, which is, could we potentially do this with what we newcomers refer to as a mixed mode configuration, but what is essentially just the classic DNS model of a server being both recursive and authoritative at the same time for different parts of the namespace. There's also something interesting to be said, I don't know whether it's good or bad, but it is certainly interesting, about the proposal to use unroutable IP space and therefore have this be an enterprise or ISP level construct that could not also have any impact on global root service. So it could be there are 4 separate non-interfering proposals, but at the moment there are only 2. Can you say why you think combination of these 2 otherwise independent, non-overlapping, non-conflicting drafts is a virtue?
Well, basically, that's the reason why I think is that my reason of the few hours that I've thought through this is that it addresses some of the concerns that were raised. The alternate route concern and some transparency to the to where the traffic is going. Those are the two main points. And Jeff wanted to.
I wanted to ask a question of Hoffman that follows directly up on that point. Could you describe for us what logic changes you think would support your draft better, as far as what you've asked, what the Microsoft people might do, or what the you had some descriptions of recursive server logic changes yesterday. Could you briefly go over those again?
So in the appendix right now, we have 3 configurations. One is bind, where bind is being used in 2 modes, one as a recursor, one as authoritative, and using bind views to keep them separate. The second one is for a combination of unbound and NSD, where it would look like just any normal use of unbound in NSD, except for the fact that NSD is running on 127, which would normally make it unusable to anybody, and it makes it unusable to everybody except for that recursor. The third is Windows Server blah. I stopped watching it in 2008, so I don't know which year it was, but they helped me through it, and I actually did touch a machine to configure it that way, where it is pretty much doing a mixed mode, very much like what Paul is suggesting. And that's the only thing it knows how to do. You can't easily set it up to be like bind with views, or even worse, 2 copies, one copy of it running on the same box as a recursive, and one copy of it running on the box as an authoritative. That, when I asked the person, well, can we do that? The silence was deafening. Now, they may eventually come up with something like views and such like that, but for right now, it is running strictly as a mixed one. So we actually, I wasn't very happy with it, but now we actually have all 3 of the models in the document, at least in for that. And in that, really the only noticeable difference to somebody, again, Edmund was saying, coming from the user's perspective, is that in the Windows model, when somebody asks the recursive for information about the root, such as an SOA or whatever, they're going to get the answer back, but it's going to have the AA bit set on. I think Jeff was next.
Right, so...
Okay. I'm sorry? Yes, okay, so for the falling back for the 3 of them, in bind, if either part dies, they both die together. In the unbound NSD case, that is not true. That is, your NSD could actually fail, and if you're not watching, then your recursor, in fact, can't see that it's not able to get anything from the root. In the Microsoft case, again, because it's mixed mode, they will fail together. Hopefully. I mean, I trust NSD and unbound to be much more separate, but I have no idea what would happen in Windows if half of a process died. Sorry, Jeff?
So I was going to pull this back again to where you are there, and observe that. observe that there are sort of two basic knee-jerk reactions in the internet. If you don't know what the problem is, put it in the DNS. And the other one is, if you don't understand the DNS, put it in routing. And in both cases, I think it's kind of wrong, right? Because routing is not a neurological piece of fine-grained surgery. It's not. It's a really big mallet. We have no idea how routing works. Our experience with uncontrolled anycast in most of the auto-tunnelling has been an unmitigated disaster. And the early days of V6 with Occade started putting packets wandering around the globe in unconstrained fashion through multiple tunnels. And even now, we're still fighting with the outcome of that kind of mess. We don't understand routing. And it worries me a lot that you're trying to put an essential part of DNS infrastructure into an unconstrained anycast model in a routing system we don't understand. And that kind of scares me a lot. And this idea that somehow we could invent some prefixes that all of the operators on the planet would abide by when they don't abide by any other rules that we can understand, go look at any Bogon list, seems to me to be an article of faith, not a piece of science. You know, it just isn't going to work like that. And so I really don't see the capability of deploying anycast in any other modes other than undeniably badly feral. And you've got to accept that as a precondition for everything else that layers on top of that. The beauty about 127001 is, as Paul pointed out, it doesn't leave the box. So no matter how you stuff up routing, and people have stuffed up routing in every possible conceivable way, you can't muck around with that prefix. You know, it just doesn't leave the box. And that's kind of the one thing that sort of saves it, that you're not relying on routing. Whereas the other one, you're relying on stuff that, quite frankly, you shouldn't be. And that's what scares me about using any kind of routed anycast prefix, Paul. It just goes feral on us. You know, the mess that is 6-4, the mess that was Occade, are recent examples of a long-standing tradition of stuffing up routing.
Question. Is it strictly unowned anycast like 6-4 and AS112 and my proposal that bugs you, or is it anycast routing in general?
Unowned anycast. It is the fact that anyone can do it and then start announcing it in strange ways, and no one else has the ability to say no.
Okay,
Right?
thank you.
Your root server prefixes that you anycast, you kind of have a stick that you can wander around and beat people around on the head saying, that's my prefix, here's my origination bits of policy, smack, smack, smack. And theoretically, you can hunt them and kill them. In unowned anycast, there's no gun, there's no killing. Anyone can do anything, and they will.
Okay, thank you.
To add to that, I'll just say this to me goes back to who's accountable, and I'll just share experience of being called. You know, we provide service for a number of TLDs. I can't tell you how many times we've been called with users complaining, saying that our name servers are busted and not answering properly, and it's all hands on deck. We go investigate. Turns out it's some upstream who has taken down a copy of the zone and is serving it authoritatively, and I have no control over that. But yet, we're the ones who are spending cycles and trying to figure out how to fix it and solve the problem for the end customer, and not the upstream. The unmanaged aspect of it really terrifies me. I will go back. I won't speak for RSAC here. I will speak as an RSAC member. There are two documents that are either out or coming out. I don't know the exact dates, but RSAC 001 is expectations of a root server. I am curious what happens to this document if a model like this is adopted. What is the bar for entry? What do you have to be this tall to ride the ride, and now we're saying you can be in the child seat to ride the ride. I have questions about that. And then again, beating a dead horse and being a broken record, measurements. I know I had a number of conversations last night. There's some people in here who have religion about data. You either have all the data or you have none of the data. As an ops guy, I want to have as much data as possible to figure out the health of something, and moving to a model to an unmanaged model, again, just terrifies me to death, because you cannot see what's happening with the health of what's going on. And sooner or later, somebody who does have a name of a root operator, they're the ones that are going to get called to say, your stuff's broken, when it won't be our stuff. It'll be somebody else's stuff, but it doesn't matter at that point.
If I can respond quickly. So these, the two comments, I just want to clarify, these are really focused on the issue of unmanaged anticast, which is the POFIC-C idea, which I kind of combined. One thing for the idea of combining is to better contain it, rather than put it as a surrogate. And the other thing, I just want to quickly, the use case scenario that you just mentioned, the Hoffman framework equally has a problem, right? Because your upstream could have been using that method, and you would have hit the same problem with the TLD that you were serving.
You just took the words out of my mouth. I would
Okay.
describe both of these as unmanaged.
Okay, perfect. That's
Well, I wouldn't, to the extent that a client of a resolver has a relationship with that resolver. And there is indeed a forwarding path that before you go belting against the authoritatives, you're going up your resolver path to find, why are my queries not getting answered? When you take the root priming query and throw it out into routing, nobody's responsible. When you take 127.0.0.1, it's kind of
he's still
the
responsible.
resolver that has that piece is the point, and that's the accountable party. And so you haven't lost accountability in 127.0.0.1, because the critical difference is you haven't thrown it into routing. And I'm kind of saying you really should think very carefully before you throw this into routing.
Actually, can I respond quickly? Actually, the responsibility is still with your resolver if you use this model, because the resolver would have been the one that put the stub in for the
Right, so
for-
they put
for
in
the
a root
altern-
hints file, and
the
the day they put
surrogate
it in,
one.
the day they put it in, Anycast had it responding within 2 milliseconds. 4 hours later, the packets are going around the world 3 times. You have no idea why routing did that to you. You're not monitoring that prefix. It's Anycast. And that's this kind of element that says there is no accountability, changes are completely random, and the resolver that did this in the hints file is kind of causing damage, but they don't understand where and why the damage is happening. 127.0.0.1 kind of says, it's me. It's me all
Okay.
the time. It's my loopback that's the problem.
okay.
Going.
Oh, okay. So I'm a little nervous about the drift that we've got here, because there's a lot of emphasis on the who, and the response to this, of course, that some people are going to bring is, well, my network, I get to do whatever I want, and I don't care about what you think. And part of the argument that is underlying both of these proposals is, since people can already do this, what we need is to define a way for people to do it consistently. That's the subtle charm of this idea. The problem with that subtle charm is that it's going to lead us in the wrong direction. And the problem, therefore, is not distrust, as has been suggested here, but rather a sort of operational stability, which is, I think, what Jeff is talking about. That is, the reason that we care about who is responsible for this is not because somebody has ownership over it, or because they're accountable, or you can take them in front of the internet police and have them charged with routing violations, but because in order to get the result that we need to be able to talk to someone. This is the reason we have the who is. This is the reason we have all of the all of the various mechanisms by which we can find somebody, because ultimately this is a collaborative effort of a network of networks, et cetera, as Paul Vixie showed yesterday. And it seems to me that this is one of the fundamental pieces of this. It happens to work as an emergent property as a global network of networks because individual networks are collaborating in a certain way and functioning in a certain way. The problem with both of these proposals, therefore, is that it takes away the mechanism by which you can say, oh, geez, this is broken. Whom can I talk to in order to make this work? It turns out there's nobody on the end of the phone in either case. Now Jeff is arguing that, well, in the local loopback case, at least you've got a guy to call. My suspicion is that in the world of automated packages that you download from a random site on the internet, the guy you're going to have to call in this case is the package maintainer for Debian. I encourage you to join the Deb users list and see how well that works for you. Because that seems to me to be the sort of path that we would go on here, right? And fundamentally, I guess this is part of the objection that I have to this. It seems to me that this is a kind of system that is much more brittle than the system that we have. The reason that the root operators have turned out to be so good at it is because the people who aren't any good at it get winnowed pretty quickly. Either they get winnowed in effect because nobody actually uses that root server, and I think we all know which one I'm thinking of, or else they get winnowed because they find that this is expensive and difficult and they don't want to do it, and so they find somebody who does. And therefore, it seems to me, if we're really concerned about the health of the internet, what we ought to do is concentrate on encouraging continued build-out of that style of infrastructure, with the understanding that the pressure is always going to be on those operators to deliver this in a way that is really responsive to the needs that people have. This means, of course, that if we're actually addressing needs that people don't have here, or that is, we haven't got the complete list of things that people really want, then we need to get that that list out. But if we do have the complete list of what people want, for instance, if our problem really is negative answers in Central Africa, then we have an answer for that, and that is deploy more of the stuff, and we just deploy it closer to networks in Central Africa. Now, I would point out that networks in Central Africa have some other problems, and so maybe we've got a lot of infrastructure work to do there. But that seems to me to be an achievable goal within the operational and technical architectural mode that we've already got. So rather than building a large number of options. I made a note here that Paul Vixie was mentioning, well, there are these individual, completely distinct proposals, and maybe we need to make another distinct one. My feeling is that we have a history of building like a whole lot of distinct boxes and then sort of filling them all in. And I guess what I'm wondering is, do we actually need those boxes? Do we need to solve that problem, or can we solve the problems that we have given the architectural model we have? I think the latter is what the case is, and we ought to concentrate on that rather than inventing new ways to do things and thereby creating new problems. Now I'll shut up.
I guess a quick response to what Andrew is saying. That's exactly my conclusion when I did this morning, and that's why this is my last slide. I was trying to improve on each of the proposals, and my feeling is it's really going nowhere because the issues are still there. And if we really are we really trying to solve, what issue are we really trying to solve? So that's the reason why this is my last slide.
Yeah, I do understand that oh, sorry, if I'm allowed to pop up several stacks. I do understand that both proposals are very similar, but if we consider some rollback mechanism, those two have totally different solutions. So if the 127 solution, if the local root server is not available, the resolver can fall back to the current mode, which would be great in some case. And also, it doesn't depend on anything on routing, so no possibility to route leak. That would be great as well.
That's certainly interesting. I think that's probably a comment to Paul Hoffman, and probably a good idea. I mean, But if that's not available, probably your machine is having more problems too, because you're running two instances on the same box conceptually, right? If one of your instances is having problem, you're saying you fall back to punting it back to the quote unquote real root. That's the idea, right? So I think I ran out of time. Or
So yeah, I think your last slide is one of the most important ones on are we actually, what we're trying to accomplish, is that actually the problem that we're really having, and is that really the problem that we're trying to solve? And I think that that's an important thing for us to keep in mind. If we're solving the wrong problem, then we're spending a lot of time talking about stuff that's not actually necessarily very helpful.
with that.
Any more questions, Edmund? So I have one. But I didn't want to get anybody's way. So, the guidance that I received from this group yesterday is best summed up by what Jeff said a moment ago, which is people are afraid of routing, and rightly so. Let me also say that folks are very concerned about the hierarchical anycast because it is unowned, and so I'm now think I have two drafts. One showing how to do this at the enterprise level, which will involve a re-signing ceremony, because that enterprise will not be able to use the IANA key. So to the extent that you want to do this inside your enterprise, you'll kind of have to make your own root hints file and your own root zone and so forth. And I make no recommendation about whether that should be done, but I have the observation that it is happening, and we ought to have a document that describes what is the best way to do it if that's what you want to do. Which is how I feel about the Hoffman-Kumari draft also. I know that people are doing this. We should have a blueprint about how to do it right if that's what you want to do. But I don't see that there is a way to combine them or a reason to combine them. So that part I did not get. But after listening carefully to what was said yesterday and sleeping on it and talking last night and listening to this, I really feel like my draft needs to become two drafts, and that's the direction I'm going to take. Do you have a recommendation? Do you have a direction that you're planning to take? Are you going to push this work forward?
Actually, as I mentioned, I think I hope the presentation and running through the combination clarifies some of the concern, the issues, and I think that served its purpose. I think that's really what I think the purpose was, to at least when I got to the end of it this morning around 7, the reality is, if this is done globally, because we started with that premise. If this is done globally, I would be very concerned either way. And the idea of combining it is to show kind of what those issues are still going to be issues, and and that served its purpose, I suppose.
So you're done after this presentation?
I'll still sit here, if that's okay.
Thank you very much for leading us through this discussion. It's been hugely useful to me as a draft author.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go
Just to
for
follow
it.
up, I keep hearing that, that there are actors doing this today, and that's why we need to document it. And I guess I'm hesitant with that, or I guess I would say we need to go forward with caution, because we shouldn't document every bad behavior on the internet. And I'm not saying this is a bad behavior, but we shouldn't document every behavior on the internet. I think there are a lot of things that people do out there that are in a gray area. Some good, some bad. I think if you are going to document something like this, I think you need to raise the bar and not only tell people how they should do it safely, but, you know, set expectations on, you know, you should, the bar is this high to ride the ride. And I guess that would be my word of caution.
So I hear, and let me amplify your word of caution, and then maybe get Suzanne to make a statement. So what you're describing is what I've been calling an applicability statement, which is that rather than merely describe if you have this use case, here is a method that you could use, I think we should always say this is something that's happening. If you want to interoperate with it or you want to do it that way, you should. But here's our guidance as to whether this approach is something you should consider and under what conditions. And I would point to David Ulovich's website, afasterinternet.com, which describes the subnet option, EDNS option, allowing CDN providers and widely anycast DNS operators, recursive DNS operators, to exchange information about the ultimate query source, the stub network between the recursive and the authoritative, so that if the authoritative is a CDN, it can offer what it considers to be the ideal version of the RR set for that particular client. And this obviously adds to the queue tuple. It means that the recursive DNS server has to have essentially another index so that you've got a lot of different answers to the same question, having the same TTL, all being different from each other, but each one having a different network prefix, and then we're adding some complexity as to which one you would use for subsequent queries that access that cache element and so forth. I view this as a terrible idea, a terrible design, an architecture that could never have been done by consensus, but it's already been built, it's already out there. And whether it's a bad idea or not, there's been a proposal that it ought to be documented, because if you want to interoperate with it, or if we want the code point to be allocated by IANA and so forth, the way the internet has to work is that there has to be some kind of a specification for it. So I've argued in that case that there be an applicability statement saying, this is controversial, some people say it's a bad idea, you should give it careful thought. Don't just treat this as a checklist item to automatically deploy in your infrastructure the way you might with RFC 1035. That is my request for such applicability statements is itself controversial and has not been decided. There's no consensus in the working group about whether that kind of applicability statement ought to be applied to every single bad idea or questionable or controversial idea that comes through. But I think it's going to. And I think that the way DNSOP works is going to be different than the way DNSEXT worked. Where DNSEXT, there were a whole bunch of graybeards, neckbeards, my son calls them, that were standing there with arms crossed, looking fiercely and saying, you want to cross the line? You got to get past us, right? Do not lard up the protocol is the discussion I heard yesterday. And I myself have quipped that there's a blink attribute in the HTML language that was added in a drunken fury at an early Mozilla Christmas party of some kind. And it shows that not every idea should go into the base protocol, but some of them are there. And a lot of people want to add things to the DNS protocol, and although I have no neckbeard of my own, I will tell you that most ideas are bad. And that is not the attitude of the DNSOP working group. It is much more collegial. It is much more, let's hear everybody out, and if we can reach consensus that this document should go forward, then the fact that a bunch of neckbeards think it's a bad idea doesn't disqualify it. That's a cultural sea change that we've made. So let me turn your question to Suzanne, who, although is not here representing DNSOP, is nevertheless a DNSOP co-chair and might be able to talk about applicability statements on stuff like this.
Yeah, there's a couple of thoughts about that. First of all, it's a pretty good description of how things work in the sense that the fact that the co-chairs don't tell the working group what to do, the working group tells the co-chairs what to do. And there is certainly a set of rules or well, there are rules, there are also expectations of how the group works, and what it takes for a document to be adopted as a group work item. There does need to be consensus support for it. In my experience with something challenging, like what you talked about with Client Subnet, which Warren is actually a co-author on that revised draft, being able to say, yeah, this is why we thought this was worth documenting, and here's where it might be worth doing, and here's where it's a really bad idea. In my experience, that makes the group more friendly to considering a work item. But what really has to happen, and frankly what you said about the attitude, the culture, is that we're trying very hard to create an environment where people can have these discussions, and then if there is work to be done, there's a decent document that's adopted and that people can agree to work on. But the consensus does have to be there that there's something worth doing. I'm looking at Warren being very... Applicability statements, you know, I can speculate what people will think of an applicability statement. I think it helps, but Warren looks like he wants to say something.
So Paul and I, mainly Paul because he's much better at writing, tried to get some of that into our draft. Sorry, other Paul, Hoffman Paul. That some people feel that they have longer than desired latency. If you're one of these people, this is how you can address that issue. And maybe more of a, and if you're not one of those people, perhaps you shouldn't do this, is more of an applicability statement. But we were trying to make it clear that this isn't a problem that everybody has. This is a problem we've heard some people express. And if you're one of those folk, here is an option to make that particular problem better. You know, if that's not your problem, go do something else.
I guess one piece that I'm looking for is to add to the proposals or proposal is that, you know, if you're going to run the route, there are documents out there that set expectations and you should abide by them, or, you know. Or
Yes, and we specifically are not saying, and you're running the route, because we don't think that most people should be running the route, because we don't think most people can do this well.
Don't speak for me, Warren.
Sorry. Okay.
I think that's a great suggestion.
I
Because
think
we are-
that's
because
that's missing.
Right, and I do think that we are suggesting that people run the route.
Exactly.
Well, for themselves. I think that that's
Let's
the big
talk about
difference.
this over a meal, Warren.
Well, but this, I mean, this goes back to a couple
But we
times
disagree.
I've heard it was for themselves or for your catchment, right? And I mean, to be honest with you, I know a lot of, I mean, how do I say it? I'll just use my family members. My family members don't have a relationship with their resolvers. They use them. They don't know who the heck they are or how to reach them. They know that when something's broken, they call me, right? And that's a very generic example. But I mean, like, to say that your user has a relationship with your resolver is naive, I think, and it's not really fair to the users or the authoritative people for the data that you're now serving, that those resolvers are now serving.
Okay, I think part of my inbuilt bias and assumption is if you're running a recursive resolver for someone, you should be responsible for making sure that you're doing it right and are not sucking. And I realize that in many cases this is not true.
Nor is it
Exactly.
written down.
Exactly.
So, in fact, going back to the question of applicability statements, it may be that our document, or Paul's document, or whoever, a document that says running a recursive that does something funky with the root zone needs to wait until we actually have a document that says running a recursive has this responsibility. Yeah. And I'm not volunteering to do that, but fortunately, Johan just did.
Just being in favor of that observation. I think getting stuff in the right order here is helpful, and that's a good idea.
Right. And also, just to be clear, I did not know that RSAC 02 was actually ever going to be published. I looked at it and I thought, okay, this will be years away. Well, that's good. Suzanne said, not to the mic, days. And that's good because, in fact, I think that, and again, this is where Warren and I might diverge, I think that any touching of the any touching of the root zone operation that is meant to be about recursive resolvers involves somebody looking more like that they're acting like a root. And I think that we might not say you need to do all of it exactly like this, but we do need to say there are the people who are currently doing this think that they are doing it like this. If you want to do it much less than that, maybe get a different hobby.
I think this has been an incredibly useful discussion, and it has gone on for almost an hour, which is about what I expected. I think we can come back to this probably during the coffee break or lunch, but that we should probably move on to some other topics. So the ways in which DNSSEC deployment has an impact on all of the proposals we heard yesterday are interesting. I myself have one bone to chew on in that, but Paul Hoffman has offered to lead us through by giving us his thoughts and getting us to sort of think about the hard problems that come about because of DNSSEC as far as deploying routes and as far as deploying DNSSEC. So let's start with that. We've got 25 minutes until the break. It's fine with me if we go on until then.
So since I don't have slides, I'm going to do it from here, if no one minds. Okay. Good. So one thing I've learned in the IETF is that if you use an idiom that's an Americanism, you should describe it first. So and I know this is an American idiom, not just an English idiom, but in the United States we have a phrase that is called the elephant in the room. You know, you're at a party, you're talking about your work and stuff like that, and you're not talking about the elephant that is in the room. You know, there's an elephant in the room you're not talking about. So Paul Vixie yesterday had put one of the elephants in the room off topic, you know, politics and how many things should be in the route and stuff. But we have a second elephant, and I'm going to point at it, and that is DNSSEC deployment. Warren and I, when we wrote our document, we said, oh, this is only really going to work if everyone who's using our proposal is doing DNSSEC. Not only is it only going to work, but if they aren't doing, and we know that some people don't, we are actually making their life worse in the sense that we are making it easier for an attacker. That is, an attacker only needs to poison one zone transfer in order to have all of the requests going to that recursor be poisoned until the next time that they actually get an update. And whereas today, currently, if there's an on-path attacker and the recursor is not using DNSSEC, every time someone goes to the route, the attacker would still have to be there. So we sort of concentrated. We said, okay, that's fine. We're going to assume DNSSEC. And I made that assumption even though I knew Jeff's numbers. And something that Andrew said yesterday at the end of the day made me think, you know what? That's just wrong. That's me not acknowledging that there's an elephant in the middle of the room, which is 20%. I mean, and again, I still find it funny, Jeff, that you could be so optimistic about it by saying, oh, but the IPv6 people would, you know, like this so much. But if we're less than 80%, and we are having we are less than, I think, Jeff could double his numbers and we're less than 80%, having a proposal that relies on DNSSEC deployment for a particular recursive operator, and if it isn't there, that you might be making their life worse, is possibly a really dangerous proposal. And so that certainly is the case for Warren's and mine, although we think for a more limited scope. It certainly is the case for Paul's as well, as you know, was discussed during the question and answer period for Paul's proposal. In talks yesterday at lunch and last night on our scenic cruise, some of the folks from CNNIC have been saying, and I've actually been talking with them offline about modifying our proposal to be more in line with one of their use cases, which is that you have like 4 or 5 recursive resolvers that are all run by the same ISP in the same location who want to talk to a local route. So they would be doing something more along the line of possibly using an unroutable address, but not localhost. And I said, oh, okay, well, then you have the same problem that we do with, DNSSEC. And, there was that sort of moment of silence, because in fact, as we can tell from Jeff's numbers, even 5 years into this large DNSSEC deployment and such, there are a heck of a lot of recursive resolver operators who are not using DNSSEC for a number of reasons. One of the reasons might be the elephant that we're not talking about, but there are other ones as well. And the discussion currently, or that was last week in DNS Op working group, on whether we should adopt the negative trust anchor proposal, showed a lot of people really didn't want to even talk about that. That would show that, like that would let more people deploy, more recursive operators deploy DNSSEC the wrong way. So we shouldn't talk about it. That should not be a working group item. I don't know where that's going to go. Suzanne and Tim get to choose that. But with respect to this specific workshop on possibly doing anything that touches the way that the root is distributed, we really, really, really should actually acknowledge the fact that 5 years into this, many, many recursive operators have decided not to deploy DNSSEC. And one of the things, especially actually when Edmund and I were talking yesterday afternoon, which led him to do slides, which I completely disagreed with, but I'm glad we had the discussion nonetheless. Edmund said, well, who are the customers here? And Warren and I thought we had some customers, recursive operators who things were too slow and stuff. But when we're talking about recursive resolvers, who is the customer turns out to be a really, really hard question. And many of us have one answer, and that's dumb. There are many answers. We will pick our favorite, but that's dumb. And I think now, unfortunately, we have to take that set of answers and double it, which is, of those people, who cares about DNSSEC and who doesn't? And of the ones who care about DNSSEC, why haven't they deployed it? And the reason I'm going on at length about this is that I think that, again, going back to what Andrew had sort of prompted yesterday, is if we're going to come up, and it was in a different light. It was about should we be hashing and signing the zone? And Andrew's response was, if you're doing something that needs to have another level of protection, which we sort of perceive that this might for the unsigned stuff in the zone, maybe you really should consider not doing that. Maybe you are doing something that has a danger that you're not really considering. And I think that's even worse when you consider the DNSSEC case. I don't know if Andrew would agree with this because we didn't talk about it, but I think that also shows that if we're going to make a change with any assumption about DNSSEC, we should, and we're going to make that change in the next 2 years, which I think some of these proposals, we would have had this meeting at the end of 2016 if we didn't think we were, going to deal with the proposals for 2 years. Then we really, really need to think about, are these proposals workable in a world where 20 or 40% of the recursive operators want to run DNSSEC? They've all had it available, basically. I mean, unless they're running DJB DNS or something weird like that, that they've had it available and they've made a choice not to. I mean, Dan York from ISOC Maine, is not here. Dan has done just a phenomenal job of letting everyone who could possibly hear the message about DNSSEC know that it's there and such. Jeff took a very small pin to that balloon and gave, real numbers. And even if we disagree with Jeff's numbers, because he's collecting data in a certain way, he would have to be horrendously wrong for this to be a much better picture than what we have. So I think we really need to think about that for either Paul's proposal, our proposal, the CN Nick proposal, whatever. Will this work without DNSSEC to a major extent? And since I was blaming you for having made me think of this, Andrew, you should start talking.
One of the reasons that I used to think, I used to believe that Dane was a really important thing for us to standardize. And the reason I thought that was because it seemed to me that we'd spent a lot of money and effort on getting people to sign their zones. And we'd probably gotten as far as we could with directives and telling people to do stuff. The next thing that had to happen was we needed to create demand. And the demand for DNSSEC as such isn't there because the if you have a problem of being misdirected, you can already detect it using HTTPS or whatever else you want, using the CA infrastructure, assuming the CAs haven't been compromised. And so Dane was the thing that you needed because it provided a mechanism by which you could tell that you were getting a signature from the wrong CA, and also it allowed you to like get out of the whole CA thing. So it was a mutually reinforcing kind of system. You create demand side, then you create supply side sort of things, and so on, and this becomes a virtuous circle. There's actually a little bit of evidence to suggest that that might be happening, but it's happening very slowly. To the extent that there is a virtuous circle to be had in these proposals, the local host one provides it, and the unmanaged Anycast one does not. The unmanaged Anycast approach doesn't actually require DNSSEC in a sort of technical sense, in that if you deploy it without DNSSEC, no internet cops are going to come and do anything about it. But we're adding some support to to operational systems. That is, we're asking IANA to do something that can't require DNSSEC because there's no way to require that, and people could go ahead and do it. So to the extent that we're worried about people doing things correctly, the unmanaged Anycast approach has this disadvantage that the local host approach does not, because the local host approach, if you're going to do it and you're saying you're going to do DNSSEC for yourself, and it could be that operators have decided not to bother with DNSSEC yet because they don't really think, well, let me put this in a more positive way. If I'm an ISP and I know my last hop is not going to do validation, then it's not clear that it's worth it to do validation. It's not clear that it's worth it for me to do validation, because if I do validation, there's still this last hop problem, and really maybe I think that the last hop ought to do something, that they ought to check it themselves. This this thing where I put the route locally, it actually encourages me to start doing DNSSEC validation in a way that it wasn't before, because now I'm going to take that data and do something with it, rather than just passing it on. That is, I'm going to provide a service based on this thing, so I need to validate the thing on which I'm providing the service. So there is it's a pretty thin argument, but you can construct one that says, well, this is a potential reason actually to start using DNSSEC in a case where you otherwise are not. And so that might be a reason why people could adopt this, could adopt DNSSEC when they're doing this, particularly if there's an encouragement to do it. I still think that's not a reason to deploy this thing, but it could be that people just don't see the value in DNSSEC yet, and I can understand that analysis, because when I do it, it leads to operational complexity. There are these failure modes, right? If you get the people from Comcast alone, they will tell you the real story about the NASA, bollocks their zone on the Mars Lander Day support cost problem, right? That was a big deal for them, and they've talked about it in public, but in private, Jason is a lot more scathing. And so if I'm a small ISP, I'm like, every single dollar of support costs is too high, and so anyone is too high, and therefore I won't do it. I think that's a live question. So, Paul, I agree with you that the worry about DNSSEC deployment is an important one, but it's also the case that each positive thing that you say, well, you get something out of this, you can build your service on top of this, might actually be a reason where it changes the calculus for somebody to do it, or at least changes the calculus for them to do it in this particular case. They might not do it generally, but they would do it for the special process that loads this zone.
Paul,
the world is certainly not uniform. And when you say, well, I want 80% of users, you know, you're kind of misrepresenting, I think, a lot of what the internet's about, because it's very lumpy, right? And some things are really prevalent in some places and really not prevalent in others. There is no DNSSEC in the Democratic Republic of Korea, right? None. There's no V6 there either, but that's a different story. Some populations are very, very big, like China. And the DNS is extremely centralised. That there is the recursive resolvers that we see asking the authoritative come from a very small set. No DNSSEC. Sweden, 80%. 80% of users have DNSSEC validation. So some countries and some communities are already well there, some aren't. And part of this is really, what are their reasons why they don't? And I personally, I think, agree with Dan. It's, in this case, a lack of information. V6, different problem. It's not lack of information, it's business imperatives. DNSSEC, lack of information, just plainly and simply that. And when you actually look at who's turned it on and why, part of it is, oh yeah, it just seemed like a good idea and it costs nothing. Because it costs nothing. Once the caches are loaded, basically the incremental cost that I've observed is extremely small. Well, zones need to have good SIGs, right? If your SIGs go fail, your authoritative server for the dud zone melts. That's life. But you know, that's about the supply side, right? On the recursive resolver side, no. So if you want 80%, you need 1,000 resolvers. That's all. I know which ones they are, so do you. I know which communities they serve, so do you. You want 80% of the users out of the, 10 million odd recursive resolvers out there, you just need 1,000. So it's not that big a problem. And I suspect Dan York's actually on the right vein here, that it really is, at this case, saying the costs of turning on DNSSEC validation are slight for the recursive resolver. So I don't see a big problem here.
I think the technical costs are not high for the recursive resolver. But when something goes wrong, you have the customer support cost. And when I was at AOL, a single call from a customer wiped out your profit for 18 months to 2 years, depending on which call center they hit. And so, turning it on is trivial. Dealing with it when stuff goes boom is the expensive part. So obviously don't let stuff go boom.
I'd rather run a domain that can be cached poison and cause those sets of calls than run a domain that can't. There's some weird economics going on here, Warren, that quite frankly you've lost me on that story.
No. The incentive for signing and the incentive for doing validation are different. Currently, customers don't call their ISPs because of cache poisoning attacks, because they're not generally seeing it happen that often. Whereas customers call, not insignificantly, take Comcast, for example, and NASA.gov, when something goes oops. But I suspect we've got way off topic here.
Yes and no. Can I get a mic?
Let me hand mine up so I don't... If I have a mic, I'm inclined to talk at it.
So you want me to, great. So yes and no, that we're fairly far off topic, because the topic that I was trying to bring up was that when we're talking about changing the root zone distribution, we're really talking about two things. One is the root zone distributors, and we're talking about their customer. And I think their customer are, by and large, would be the recursive resolvers. Certainly that's the way that Warren and I looked at ours. I think that's somewhat the way that Paul looked at his. If we have a set of customers who have a belief now in what they should or shouldn't be doing today about DNSSEC, and that would affect proposals, I think we need to look at that. You're right that this could change soon. The next time you run your numbers, I will be very interested in looking at lines between the previous numbers and the new numbers. That would be great. If we are already leveled off, we're hosed. If we're actually, on the early side of the hockey stick, there are not many people in this room who play hockey, I believe, but, That's good. Actually, he was about to hand the mic to Terry, so that's good. That's good too. But I think that, and again, this is going back to what Andrew sort of inspired me on, is that we need to think about the environment of where we're at or where we will be when these new things come out, of, is that really a good idea? And I'm starting to feel like maybe it is not such a good idea. I mean, Andrew re-inspired me a little bit about Warren's and my proposal of that we might actually get those people to, in fact, understand that they need to do DNSSEC. That could also be true for Paul's proposal as well. But that's a pretty different spin on it than what we said yesterday. And I think that's important.
Let me jump in here, since I did speak to this yesterday in my slide deck. I do not believe that current DNSSEC deployment levels or historic trends are informative to this discussion. I think that the Kumari-Hoffman draft says pretty clearly, if you want to do this, first turn on DNSSEC, then add this other stuff that'll cause you to have a local copy. My draft says the same. So there are two concerns which I consider to be so non sequitur that I'm surprised we spent time on them, but they turned into huge time sinks for us. One non sequitur is, well, what if people misread it, or they just don't like part of it and they decide to unbundle the suggestion and only create a secondary, slave of the root and decide that we were wrong about DNSSEC? Okay, I don't think that either Kumari, Hoffman, or I are capable of forcing somebody to adopt all or nothing. You can only write the document and let people make their own choices. There is no internet police force to say, oh, you took part A but not part B. So I don't think that we should be arguing about what might happen if somebody decides to only run a loopback root server and not also turn on DNSSEC validation. That's not what the proposal says, so we don't need to worry about the fact that some people might do that. We just have to worry about whether the language in the draft is clear enough. The second non sequitur has to do with treating the current DNSSEC penetration in the recursive DNS market as indicative of appetite. I think there are a huge number of people who haven't done it because they don't know about it, or because they've got more important stuff to do. This isn't hurting them right now. Other stuff is. And it isn't necessarily an indication that people heard, they investigated, they did some research, and they decided, no, the cost benefit is wrong, I don't want to do that, it's just a new source of error, it doesn't add value, whatever. I don't think we have an informed non-audience. I think we have an uninformed non-audience. And that if these proposals went forward, they would reach both the audience of people who, yes, they've decided I will run DNSSEC, and they're already doing it, this is just one more addition to what they're already doing, or an audience of people who said, I had no idea that the DNSSEC even existed, but clearly, since I want to run a loopback name server, I need DNSSEC. So I actually think that both my proposal and the Kumari-Hoffman proposal could result in more of a hockey stick. We could actually get some DNSSEC deployment as a side effect of this. And that's the way to look at it, not as saying, well, we've only reached X number of percent, so clearly there's no market for the proposal that Kumari and Hoffman or Vixie have put forward. So those are two non sequiturs that I heard go by yesterday that I really want to challenge both.
Excuse me, I just have a point of information here. On the loopback proposal, all that matters is that you have a guaranteed accurate copy of the root zone, and it doesn't matter whether you got it via TSIG or whether you got it via some new DNSSEC checking the signature thing, or because Fadi brought it to you wrapped in gold paper, right? Okay, so that's really brush that we need to clear away. I mean, you can actually go and implement your proposal. The DNSSEC part is nice, but it's really orthogonal. As long as you have an accurate copy of the root zone, you're good to go.
No.
Why not?
There's two reasons. I disagree for two reasons, one of which is a presentation I'll give after the break. But the other is being able to validate the content of the root zone is only part of the reason you care about DNSSEC. It's because those signatures are there that you can then follow a chain from the root zone to other stuff that is secure. So it becomes vitally important that you be able to trust the signatures and have in your hand the signatures for all of the TLDs, or you're not going to be able to see the rest of the namespace as secure. So I want to say...
That's what you get in an accurate copy of the root zone.
Okay, so if by having an accurate copy you mean that the signatures are all still there, then yes, that's fine. Warren?
So hopefully I'm not speaking too much for Paul Hoffman and making things up. But the reason I thought that we had written this is, our document, is that we had heard that people are having less than desired performance to root zones or to root servers. Neither Paul nor myself are actually having that issue. We've heard that others have it. If that's not actually an issue, then maybe we don't need our thing. We've heard it from multiple different sets of people, so we have no reason to assume that they're just making it up. But if they're mistaken...
That would be good. Terry, can you say why you did it in the past?
In the past, I did it for reliability concerns. So owning my own dog food. It was not about the time it took to get to a root instance. It was a time in the evolution of the internet structures in Australia where international bandwidth was interesting. It was expensive. It was error prone. Doing things like that made the organization more resilient. Now, putting back on my root server hat, if there are people who have issues about the latency to do queries to a root server, I would love to talk to them.
Okay, excuse me.
And same for every other probably operator within this room.
I feel sure that that is the same for every root operator in this, well, probably all of them. If there's a problem, the root ops would like to know what it is. I think I could speak for all of them fairly in that regard, although they have not all given me permission to say that. It is break time. We can pick this discussion back up in 30 minutes or change topics, but we'll decide at that time. So please be back by 11 o'clock. Thank you.